We're live. Friends, welcome to Be Waste Wise. I'm Ranjit Anipu. I co-founded Be Waste Wise along with Katrina Mitchell and Columbia University's Earth Engineering Center in 2013 to make high-quality expertise easily accessible. Over the past 5 years, we've organized webinars with more than 200 leaders and experts in circular economy and waste management. And the quality of our speakers is so high that if you wanted this kind of content, you'd have to spend thousands of dollars in attending conferences. We know that's not possible for everyone. Waste is a global challenge with local solutions, and there are leaders from every part of the society ready to lead with access to the right expertise. Now, in 2 years, our goal is to complement large reports and compete with conferences as the only existing sources of knowledge. Our community builder, Shweta Dandapani, is unable to host this webinar today. She'll be back for the online conference we are organizing with International Solid Waste Association's Young Professionals Group. They have put together a great lineup of speakers to help you with transitioning from open dump sites to a circular economy. So sign up and join us. And with that, I'd like to thank Kate Bailey, Eric Lombardi, and Gerry Higgins for joining us today. I've been a big fan of both Kate and Eric's writing. They're thought leaders in the space, and they also work at EcoCycle, only one of two nonprofits or / social enterprises in the US providing waste management services. Eric, correct me, which one it is and what's the difference between them. Now, if you're watching this live, this is the best part about Be Waste Wise. You can interact with panelists directly. So use the live chat window below the video screen. We'll be taking questions and comments throughout the session. So don't wait until the last minute to ask because they might not get answers. So with that, Kate, thanks for moderating. It's yours from here.
Great, thanks so much, Ranjit. And thanks everyone for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. And I just wanted to first start off by saying thanks to Ranjit for providing this wonderful service to people. It really is a tremendous learning platform, and be able to access this type of quality content for free is an incredible gift to increasing recycling and building better waste management solutions throughout the world. So thank you, Ranjit, for having us. This is my third panel with the Be Waste Wise platform. And just to give you a little bit background on myself before we jump into our speakers. My name is Kate Bailey. I work at EcoCycle. We are a nonprofit social enterprise working in zero waste, and we've been around since 1976. And my position is really to help communities around the world improve their recycling systems based on our experiences. EcoCycle has a lot of experience creating community infrastructure, policies, and programs to reduce waste and increase recycling. We're involved with every sector of the community, from residents to businesses, local governments, events, and schools. And we have a staff of nearly 70 people really with their hands-on experience every day trying to build a zero waste community. So we don't just advocate for zero waste, we actually work on it every day. So with that, today we're going to talk about how social enterprises fit into the zero waste movement and how transforming business opens up new opportunities. And I'm going to start by introducing Eric Lombardi, who was our executive director at EcoCycle for 24 years, and now is a senior advisor with us and helping to encourage social enterprise growth in the US as well as around the world. Eric is an experienced public speaker, policy advocate, strategic community planner, and business person, working to connect the people and best practices from around the world to facilitate the building of zero waste communities through the expansion of the social enterprise model. Eric is a strategic advisor to EcoCycle and associate to the Social Enterprise World Forum. As the executive director of EcoCycle, he grew the organization to become one of the largest community-based recycling social enterprises in the world, and currently processing over 50,000 tons of diverse recycled materials every year. Eric was invited to the Clinton White House in 1998 as one of the top USA recyclers, and was a co-founder and past president of the US Grassroots Recycling Network. He was also co-founder of the Zero Waste International Alliance based in Wales and served on the board of the U.S. National Recycling Coalition and co-founded the U.S. Nonprofit Recyclers Council. So in short, you could not have a better wealth of information here today to talk about zero waste and social enterprises. So with that, Eric, I'm going to ask you to start us off and give us a little history about how you came into social enterprise. You started working with a recycling organization. Did you have an aha moment, or sort of what happened to connect the recycling movement with this social enterprise idea?
Hi, Kate. Good morning. And I'm so glad to be here once again on this wonderful format. And hello to everybody out there in cyberspace. Yes, I've been at this nearly 40 years at this point. Started off in the trenches with nonprofit recycling, North Carolina and Boulder. And so it's been a wonderful ride watching recycling start off as something that was kind of fringe, and it's become mainstream now over the last 35 years or so. So I've seen it all from, the street level to the city council level to the state level to the national level. And so it's grown. It's been a wonderful run. But we've sort of run into some roadblocks the last 10 or 15 years as far as growth in the United States goes. And that's what brings me to social enterprise. EcoCycle, as we grew to become one of the largest nonprofit recyclers in the country, we became financially self-sufficient in the early 90s. And that was the social enterprise side. And we were creating services that people were willing to pay for. And we were doing resource management. We were introducing our community resource management. And our growth curve was really significant in the 90s, and we were all loving it and having a great time. But I ran into a ceiling on funding because just past the turn of the millennium, cities and counties felt like the recycling question had been answered. So they were no longer putting big money into it, and neither were foundations. And as a nonprofit recycler, we needed access to capital to keep growing. And the next logical step in Boulder County, where we were operating, was to build a compost facility. And we could not gain access to enough money, $6 million. And so the government wasn't there for us. The foundations weren't there for us. The local bank was not there for us because, as the bank president said, Eric, I could never foreclose on a loan to EcoCycle because we'd be the biggest villain in town. So really, you're asking us to become a partner, and as a bank, we don't partner that way. So here I was running a $5 million nonprofit, and we didn't have access to money to keep growing. And that's when I discovered social enterprise over in Scotland. In the UK, basically, they had this thing called for-profit social enterprises, which I'd never heard of before. And just to simplify it to the American listener, think of a nonprofit like EcoCycle that is allowed to take a certain percentage of private investment money and pay out up to 1/3 of our profits each year to a private investor. That's the key difference. The social enterprises in the UK have asset locks, just like we have nonprofits are asset locked in the United States, where you have no exit strategy. You can't sell the company and pocket the money. We have financial disclosure. We have responsibility to pursue our mission first. So it's really this financial aspect that was my aha moment when I realized I need that to keep growing EcoCycle. That's where the money is for us to build the compost facility. And that's why I started getting involved with Gerry Higgins and the Social Enterprise World Forum. And then I discovered there was the for-profit social enterprise world was starting to really take off around the world. And I wanted to be part of that.
Awesome. That's, I think many people can relate to that transition of sort of being stuck in the nonprofit space and wanting to grow and really wanting to pursue the mission, but being limited by the capital accessibility. So I also appreciate that you've already brought Gerry into the conversation as sort of an inspiration, and you found what's happening in Scotland as really a direction that you could take a nonprofit towards social enterprise. So we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about the recycling space. But first, I want to transition over and introduce Gerry. Thanks so much for joining us, Gerry, from well, based in Scotland, but currently in London, my understanding. So for those of you on the call, Gerry is a world expert on social enterprises, and we are thrilled to have him join us today. He is currently the managing director of the Social Enterprise World Forum and director of international enterprise at Community Enterprise in Scotland. These dual roles were created in this past January because the Social Enterprise World Forum required more capacity to support its ambitious program to build a global social enterprise movement. And after 13 years as CEO of Community Enterprise in Scotland, Gerry wanted to focus on the international dimensions of social enterprise in Scotland. Gerry is also director at Social Value Lab, CIES Ayrshire, DSL Business Finance, Social Enterprise UK. So Gerry is clearly a busy guy. So again, Gerry, thanks so much for making time for us. Gerry also has a BA in education and it was awarded an honorary fellowship of Social Enterprise UK in 2017. So with that, Gerry, thank you for joining us. And I am hoping that you can just introduce the concept of social enterprise to the folks on the line and sort of clarify the distinction between for-profit and nonprofit in this unique space that social enterprise is carving out.
Sure. I hope everybody can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Good. I guess the modern iteration of social enterprise began a couple of decades ago as nonprofits got frustrated with grant dependency and donor and philanthropic relationships and the lack of sustainability about those type of transactions. So I've been working in this space since 1988. And at that point, we saw something emerging in the UK, which was, it's recognizable today as the start of our latest social enterprise sector, our social enterprise movement. But in reality, social enterprise has existed for as long as business has existed. And the bit that's happened in recent centuries is the focus on shareholder return. But if you go back some centuries, businesses were very often geared to addressing community issues and social issues. It was about adding value rather than extracting. So we've been working for the last couple of decades with groups around the globe to support social enterprise with a view to doing a range of things like alleviating poverty, improving living and working conditions, and increasingly addressing environmental issues. And social enterprise, because the world doesn't have a homogeneous approach to legal structures and business, social enterprise is different things in different places. The things that are important to us include, regardless of how a business is structured, include primacy of mission. So the social and environmental mission need to have primacy. We engage with, but we're not viewing as our primary stakeholders, companies that trade return profits to shareholders and also do something nice with some of the surpluses. That's not the piece we're interested in, because that can change, and new ownership, all of that system can change. So we view our core constituency, our social enterprises, where they're established in order to address an environmental issue or a social issue, and that's going to be in their DNA from now until permanently. We look at things like ethical and ethics and transparency. That if you're a social enterprise, you should pay attention to how you do things as well as what you do. So if you're doing great guns in community recycling, but you're paying people at below living wage, you're probably missing the point in the rationale of having an ethical business. So we typically work with social enterprises that are independent of state. You started off, I came in on Eric's piece about mentioning frustration with nonprofits. Many countries have nonprofit structures that are allowed to trade and have tax efficiencies, Because if you're sitting in government, what do you want to have from your business? You want businesses to address social and environmental issues. And if you've got groups like social enterprises, where they're pretty well gender balanced, typically, there's low pay differentials between the highest and lowest paid members, because it's hard to have really high differentials in a values-based business. So they really contribute to creating an inclusive economy. You know, it helps economic growth. So some countries have introduced legal structures that enable nonprofits to trade and, for instance, not pay any tax on their surpluses. Or the other approach that happens increasingly is that nonprofits can own for-profit structures. And with the treatment of surpluses, that becomes tax efficient because the surpluses are either gift-aided or covenanted to the nonprofits. So this is growing throughout the world, alongside new models like B Corps and which are also coming into the space. We see the two as in the big tent, but there are differences. In the case of many of the B Corps that have converted to being social enterprises, they recognize that there's a competitive advantage to them in doing that. And they're certainly in many cases performing a lot better than the equivalent private business, but fundamentally we regard them as allies in the same way as we do government, in the same way as we do corporate partners, in the same way as we do nonprofits that are enterprising. But there are tens of thousands of social enterprises around the world dedicated to their social mission or environmental mission, who are going about this in the way I've described.
That's great, Gerry. I really appreciate that you came at it that social enterprises are mission first, right? It's not profit first, and then we're doing some good on the side. It's first and foremost mission. And I think that is a little bit of a distinction, at least in my mind, with the B Corp community, which is a little bit more profit first and then mission. So I see a little bit of a distinction there. I'm wondering, Eric and I were chatting earlier, and Eric, you can chime in on this too, but the distinction also between social enterprises as a business structure and social entrepreneurs as an individual. We talk a lot about social entrepreneurs, especially in the US, and so I'm just wanting to clarify the difference for our audience.
Yeah, so not all entrepreneurs are social entrepreneurs. And one of the big differences in our world is there's a global focus on entrepreneurship. And there are a small number of rock star entrepreneurs that are on stage describing their plans to change the world. In the case of social entrepreneurs, that's their plans to have impact with tens of thousands of people, whether it's on clean water or solar power. All of that is okay. They get their investment, they create their impact. It has huge profile. They get to go to various events with other entrepreneurs and speak about their ventures. And we occasionally will engage in that world and help some of those better stories to inspire and to motivate the people we're working with. But the reality is, literally there are probably hundreds of thousands, certainly many tens of thousands of social enterprises, some of reasonable scale, where the focus isn't actually on the leader. The focus is on the organization, its values, its commitment to mission, its solidity, its succession strategy. So actually, it can be dangerous if the focus is on the leader, and especially if they're an entrepreneur whose trajectory is to set up to move on to the next big thing. And we've seen lots of cases where following the departure of that entrepreneur, it's hard, the business finds it hard to maintain its position and maintain its impact. So entrepreneurship is overlapping very much with the social enterprise movement. But for us, it's not all about the brilliantly articulate entrepreneurs who have all that stage time. So there is a distinction. Clearly, all social enterprises need entrepreneurs. You need to be in touch with your market. You need to be able to see where the next developments are from. But actually, if you think about sectors like the community recycling sector, if you're going to have buy-in from the community, it rarely is because there's one person who's leading it, who's getting all the airtime. It's because you pay attention to how to collectivize and how to engage with all of the people and have a structure that gives them a voice and has a greater level of democracy.
Kate, I'll jump in on that.
Sure.
I really appreciate that message from Gerry. That's the international perspective on social enterprise that we really need to be speaking about in the United States more. I heard that message for the first time in 2008 when I went to Gerry's conference in Scotland. And now I quite often guest lecture at the University of Colorado Business School. And the class is usually called something like social entrepreneurship. And so when I get in there and I start talking about the perspective that you just heard about the difference between the entrepreneur as a heroic individual versus an actual business, a hybrid business structure, even the professors are fascinated because, you know, it's kind of new here to think about creating a hybrid business approach. And the United States, the home of unfettered capitalism, it's an uncomfortable discussion for us to have. But I'm finding over the last 10 years of speaking in the business school, it's becoming more accepted. There's a lot more talk about the B Corp. And so and I appreciate what Gerry said about the B Corp. They are a strong ally, yet they are not, in my opinion, they're not truly the mission-driven social enterprise that I'm talking about, that the US needs to start understanding the value and opportunity available in. But I'm seeing positive trend in the business school, the difference between social entrepreneurs as people and social enterprises as hybrid business structures, that's starting to be defined more clearly. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, and we have a question from the audience about the definition and whether or not, so this question is for Eric or Gerry, if social enterprise is a legal term in the way that B Corp is a legal term.
Take it, Gerry.
B Corp is a legal term in the USA and in other countries, but not everywhere. And in the same way that there are many dozens of legal structures rather than terms for social enterprise. It depends which country you're in. If you're in Korea, a social enterprise is very clearly defined. If you were to email the Korean Social Enterprise Promotion Agency right now, they could tell you, if it's in the right time zone, how many social enterprises there are. In parts of Africa, it is not possible for a non-profit to trade. So you have the huge challenge that most social enterprises take for-profit structures. They don't distribute their surpluses to shareholders. They distribute and reinvest them in the interest of their social mission. But that's not locked in. It's done on a voluntary basis because that's the only structure that exists. So our concern is to work with governments, which we're working with governments around the world, help them to recognize that it makes sense to have legal structures that work for social enterprise, that makes it tax efficient, that makes sure that funds that are generated in the interest of a social mission are locked in to support that social or environmental mission. So some countries have structures for social enterprises that are legally defined. In the UK, we have several, which in some cases makes it a problem because you're choosing which one do you want to have. Eric mentioned the community interest company, where you can have up to 35% external shareholding, and that's viewed as a way of increasing the flow of capital into social enterprise. So at the moment, there's a global trend, which is social enterprises are increasing in number. Governments are increasingly developing policy for social enterprise, and the whole landscape looks unrecognizable from 10 years ago when Eric and I first sat down to meet. So this trajectory is going to continue, and we've had 330% growth in attendance at World Forum over 10 years, and last year we had 47 countries participating in our event as opposed to 26 countries 10 years ago. So there's real momentum in this.
That's
Kate,
fantastic. encouraging to see that it is a global movement despite differences in how we define business structure. And I can only imagine the differences in different countries on all sorts of tax things and things like that. So to see everyone coming together around this concept and then sort of trying to work out the nuances themselves is just incredibly inspiring. So thank you for leading that charge. I wanted to give our audience a reminder that we are taking live questions for both Gerry and Eric, so please chat those in as you get a chance. I think we could probably spend the whole time just talking about sort of the legal structure and some of the definitions and the roles, but I want to circle back a little bit to recycling and zero waste and dive a little bit more into how social enterprise applies to resource management. And how that relates to the folks in the audience who are working in the waste sector. So Eric, I'll start with you since you have hands-on experience running a social enterprise in the recycling sector. Can you talk us through some other groups in this space, other places in recycling or reuse or some just general examples of social enterprises in this sector?
Sure, Kate. And I'm very interested in the idea of the mission-driven recyclers scaling up in America, because EcoCycle, we scaled up and we sort of hit the ceiling. And we also have two other large ones in the country. St. Paul, Minnesota has a group called Eureka, and Berkeley has the Ecology Center. So these are kind of the big three in the US. And all of us have this challenge where we've gotten so big that the local governments and the banks, nobody quite knows what we are or what to do with us. And the large trash, the waste, the traditional waste industry doesn't know what to do with us. And so I'm very interested in that question because we're starting to see in the clean energy and the resource management area, which is, I'll shift away from waste and I'll start calling it, instead of waste management, resource management. So we're starting to see the opportunities really grow, but it's being slowed down by the single bottom line approach. There's just not enough fast profit for the big companies to pour a lot of money into it. So we're starting to see some innovative partnerships between local government and social enterprises talking about scaling up the resource management and the clean energy industries. It's very early days. It's very exciting to see what's happening. A lot of rural communities are really talking about it seriously. I know in the UK there's some fascinating community clean energy initiatives being born over the last couple of years where the social enterprises are scaling up to a size not seen before. And let me add one thing about this. Social enterprise, this approach is not necessarily new to the United States. If you go back 100 years and think about rural electrification in America, there was no profit in that. Yet the government didn't have the money to invest in it. So they created 20-year contracts with local utility companies to extend electricity all across the countryside. And in exchange for doing that, the contract said, we will pay your capital investment back over a 20-year period, and we will guarantee you a 10% operating profit every year. So this sort of I would call that a social enterprise contract, because it was good for the community, and it was good for the utility, and it was not an unfettered capitalist approach. It was sort of a shared risk-reward formula that brought community benefit. And that's exactly where we're at today with clean energy and resource management. We need to scale it up, we need to bring community benefit, but we need to let business take the lead and government as a supporter of that structure.
So it sounds like some of your challenges in running a social enterprise in the recycling sector is the idea that waste has to be a profitable activity, and that it's looked at solely from that lens rather than the larger community benefit. And I imagine other folks on the line probably are struggling with that same mantra. So I'm wondering if you can give any advice to the people out there working on their own social enterprise in recycling. How you started to get that message across to the community.
Okay, first, let me say, I love profit. I think profit is the driver behind innovation and growth, so I'm not anti-profit. What I am, though, is saying that we have some dirty industries that need to transform. And when I say dirty, I mean landfills, and waste to energy facilities. I consider them dirty. I don't consider them resource management. And I consider the recycling and composters who are competing with them on an uneven playing field. Thus, that justifies the public sector intervention. So what I would really like to see is something that Scotland has again pioneered. Zero Waste Scotland is an organization full of professionals who understand the resource management industry, and they sit between, they're kind of quasi-government. They sit between the government and the private sector in Scotland. And the conversation that is happening over there is high quality because the government trusts Zero Waste Scotland knows what they're talking about, and the business sector trusts that Zero Waste Scotland understands the business side of their industry. And so when Zero Waste Scotland sits down with a single bottom line private trash hauler and says, join us in the future, we're going to transform from waste to a resource management system, the private business knows that they're not talking to a government bureaucrat, they're talking to a practitioner who came from the trenches. So I think the Zero Waste Scotland model of an intermediary organization between government and private sector is really an innovation that I would like to see happen more. And it's a model for the US to copy. It's not going to be easy to create because it's going to take a lot of faith and support from the public sector. But I think it's the way to go forward with this conversation of, number one, there's going to be money to be made. And number two, community benefit is actually the primary purpose of the new partnerships.
Gerry, I'm wondering if you can speak a little, kind of taking Eric's points about Zero Waste Scotland. We have a question from someone in Trinidad and Tobago who says that social enterprises are not recognized in their legal structure for companies. So they're trying to work on getting that changed and wondering, so two questions for you on this front. One, have you tried any work in the Caribbean on social enterprise? And then just to complicate things a little bit more, the Caribbean, most of the Caribbean does not have stringent waste laws. So you have a lot of open dumping and you do not have people willing to pay for trash service. People are considering it free. So I guess any advice you can offer on the Caribbean would be greatly appreciated.
Okay, I'm probably the worst qualified on the call to answer the second part of that question because my expertise is not in the waste management side. But on the first part of it, we Social Enterprise World Forum is a network of organizations, including some of the leading membership bodies for social enterprise around the world. And one of our partners, Social Enterprise UK, has done some work in the Caribbean, including advocating for structures that will either allow for-profits to have a type of incorporation that recognizes their social and environmental work in the form of a tax benefit accompanied by an asset lock, or sometimes it's easier to use non-profit legislation to allow non-profits to trade, which can be an easier route because they possibly already have tax efficiency. And what we have is models of this from around the world that, depending on what strategy a government might find easiest to get through. There's probably one that looks at law or looks at taxation and looks at an amendment to an existing law so that it doesn't take 3 years to introduce and it can possibly happen in as soon as 6 months. And for anybody who, if people aren't on the call and are looking at the message, one of the ways of approaching this is to encourage the policymakers from a country to attend something like the World Forum, where we expect that this year's World Forum in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, there'll be between 110 and 120 people attending a policy forum the day before the main event. And the main event will have 1,200 people at it, but there'll be a policy forum for people who whose role it is to contribute to and to design and implement policy, and that includes social enterprise leaders and people like Zero Waste Scotland, as Eric mentioned. But one of the best ways of working out what's right for your country is to be in a room with people from 40 other countries who are at various stages of this journey, from just starting out to actually a few years of experience and knowing what's worked and knowing what would you'd like to change, and also the very experienced. So if people can encourage anybody from government ministers to policymakers to come along and engage with this dialogue. Nobody wants to be known as a country that has really poor environmental practices and environmental standards. And the global economy is changing, and usually there is a motivation in all countries not to be seen as laggards in this move to having a more sustainable economy. And therefore, in that, there's very often an ability to convince people to come and engage with this dialogue. And we can also provide some support. If people contact Social Enterprise World Forum, we can possibly look through our network at who might be able to assist. Sometimes it's a local conference, and there's some form of there's some education stuff online as well through our partners in SEI, Social Enterprise Institute, and they've got a lot of modules that are video modules about how to start and what to do and where to seek support.
Kate, can I jump in? Yes. So I'm so glad someone wrote in Trinidad. This is perfect example. I think I was down there 7 years ago or so, Kate, as you remember, working with the government on a zero waste plan that ended up going nowhere. But if Gerry had been with me, then I would have presented the zero waste community plan. Gerry would have talked about how Trinidad could bring social enterprises into being, and something might have happened. But as it is, nothing happened. And I've seen that through my 40 years of doing zero waste building. Nothing happens after the plan is on the table because the government can't do it. The private sector won't do it. There's not enough profit, and nonprofits are a Band-Aid. So this is why we need a fourth way. We need this hybrid business approach that the government understands. And so Trinidad is a great example. And whoever wrote that question, I hope the person contacts me, because we actually did formulate a brief zero waste community plan for Trinidad that just sat on the shelf because the government didn't know what to do with it. And this is, again, a perfect opportunity for a Zero Waste Scotland type organization to be formed so that the government and the private sector could have a meaningful discussion about a new way to move forward.
Great. So we'll just send you and Gerry around the world and meeting with all these local government officials, and we'll get things going. So thank you for your question. That was excellent. Eric, I have another question for you about sort of getting things off the ground. This one is about some of the councils that you formed throughout your career, and if there's ways that those could be a tool to grow social enterprises in the US or other countries.
Well, the councils were valuable when we created them. But I think now zero waste community building is such a local issue that I really like the Zero Waste Scotland model better, the way they've created the local council, if you want to call it that, but it's actually not a council. It's made up of government and private sector and content experts. The mission-driven recyclers are at the heart of Zero Waste Scotland, so they bring an expertise that everybody can relax and breathe into and trust. So I would say, yes, councils are an important place to talk, but the next evolution of that now is action, and Zero Waste Scotland is showing us how to actually get stuff done.
And other countries are doing that as well. I mean, New Zealand is a great example where there's stuff done commercially by large operators, but communities have a huge stake, because ultimately, if the communities have a long-term interest in the community. They're not just interested in the financial transaction that they're going to get from either preventing stuff from ending up in landfill or from dealing with it. And that's why in places like New Zealand, we're getting a lot of innovation around the role of communities. And some communities are doing the solid stuff, making sure that there's as much reuse as possible, and others are getting more ambitious and doing this in through the medium of social enterprise. There's Blue Skin Energy project in New Zealand, run by resilient communities, and they're democratizing electricity. You can use their online facility to select where your electricity is coming from in terms of its sustainability, and you can do that by electricity types. And in India, you've got the giant of Selco, and absolutely fabulous social enterprise, addressing the problem of rural poverty through solar facilities. Stoves that power looms and bellows and blacksmiths are solar powered, because Selco have used technology and their network of community activists to transform businesses and to make a huge difference in rural poverty. So I think when communities are given a role and support and capacity building, that's really an important part of the solution going forward.
And Kate, I'd like to add one other thing. There's a group I'm watching out of Australia that I'm very excited about. Their name is Social Traders, and they're focused very heavily on the government procurement side, all the tax dollars in Australia being spent for community benefit. And so what Social Traders has done is they've created a simplified certification program to be a social enterprise, so that government, if they're going to give preference to a social enterprise in contracting, they know it's the real deal. So Social Traders is sort of a certification council, if you want, for the government to understand who they're dealing with and who they're giving preference for. So I think that's another evolution forward. I'm not sure the certification is a legal structure as much as it's just a certification by Social Traders, who is a trusted organization by the local governments in Australia. So keep an eye on them. I know Michelle asked that question, and check them out.
Yeah, they're part of our board. Sorry, Kate, if I just finish Eric's sentence. They're part of the Social Enterprise World Forum board, and they're part of a global movement, which is around social procurement, convincing both corporates and governments that the products, works, and services that they purchase will create more value if they're purchased from a social enterprise. In Australia, they've recognized that, well, it probably would help if you had a certification system, so that they can, that if preferential scoring is happening in procurement and tendering, that it's going to an agency that is doing what it says it's doing. So that's a welcome development. But around the world, increasingly, both corporates and governments are looking at a huge spend. I mean, I'm predicting that in 5 years' time, the amount that corporates will be spending on social procurement will completely dwarf the amount they're spending on CSR. This is an irreversible direction of travel, because instead of spending CSR dollars that are rooted in a philanthropic one-way transaction, to actually purchase products and services that you need anyway, from a company that's either using a workforce that's disadvantaged or doing something good for people and planet with it, and allowing you the ability to articulate that internally, helps you with your staff retention, helps you with your staff recruitment, helps you build, helps your organization articulate how it's delivering on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So this is absolutely a huge area. And if anybody wants further information, we did a massive online open course with SAP in January, and all of the units are available to view on the SAP platform and under social procurement, and it's got 20 different lectures on it, and geared towards procurement professionals. So if you want to help someone to understand how they can change the way they're purchasing and commissioning things, that's a good place to start.
Excellent. I appreciate the shout out about resources and more information. Definitely getting lots of questions about that. So thank you. And just super inspiring to hear about the procurement movement and the way that government can help support social enterprise in how it spends its dollars. We've talked a lot about nonprofits moving into the social enterprise space, and we've talked about government supporting these nonprofits. And I'm wondering, getting questions from people who work for current for-profit businesses and what it looks like for them to transition into the social enterprise space. Is that harder for a for-profit than it is for a nonprofit? And what kind of resources might be available both in the US and around the world for that?
It can be equally hard for a non-profit or a for-profit to transition into social enterprise. For a non-profit, if their culture and systems are based in the philanthropic grant receiving entity, it can be hard to change the organization culture. It's not just a question of drafting a new financial plan and then heading boldly in that direction. You actually need to change your systems, your approach, possibly some of your board. It can be difficult to make a successful transition. For a non-profit, very, very motivated by the social or environmental element of what they do, but less motivated about or less equipped to deal with it as a business where they're looking at the financial transactions. That can be difficult, but it's not impossible. And with support at leadership level and support at capacity building, countries that have support programs see a significant number of nonprofits making a transition over time to be more and more enterprising, to the point where they actually have an enterprising culture, and you come into that group and you recognize actually this is an enterprising organization, not an organization that's waiting for stuff to happen. For for-profits, it can be really difficult because if the focus is on shareholder or owner return, then truly switching to to a situation where your social or environmental mission has primacy can be a step too far in many cases. I don't see many that are making the transition. Things like B Corp are a way of letting people continue to have a focus on the profits and the surpluses and the returns to shareholders, yet to lock in something which is permanent in relation to their social mission. And that's, it's no surprise that B Corps have had great traction in many parts of the world and are expanding. So they're part of our. We include B Corps in our mission or in our interaction because they're an antidote to the extractive, shareholder-dominated modern economy. But they're not the same as, for us, social enterprises where the environmental or social mission has primacy. And I'll finish on this one, one of the really important things is that 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I started my social enterprise journey, it was almost impossible to get people to come from the commercial sector into social enterprise. And now it's getting increasingly easy to get people from the commercial sector who want to work in business, but they're completely motivated by the social or environmental purpose, the opportunity of using your business skills in a business that contributes to people and planet. That's viewed as a threat by the corporate sector because they're losing talent to businesses that are able to better articulate their impact on the planet. But it's a huge opportunity for social enterprises. And if many people find themselves in an organization where they enjoy their job and they enjoy their colleagues, but they don't respect the values of the company and the impact it's having on the world, well, move.
Kate, let me add one thing, if I may. You're talking about private businesses and nonprofits transitioning. I want to mention the idea of local governments transitioning also. Now, in the United States, government doesn't have a great reputation. A lot of people have a problem with activist government. But I believe that what we need to see for clean energy systems and community zero waste systems to be built is we need to see local governments take a paradigm shift on what the market will and won't do. The marketplace is not going to solve this situation because the playing field is uneven. So I'm very much interested in the United States story of local governments getting the idea that they too need to transition on how business is going to go forward in their community. And they too need to adopt a social enterprise approach to community benefit, which they really have never had before. And then they can become supporters for the for-profits and nonprofits who want to be more enterprising for community benefit. So that's the big shift I see needed in the United States at this point.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. This isn't just social enterprise doing its thing. It's social enterprise working with nonprofits, working with corporations, working with government, all moving forward for environmental and social benefits. So not one or the other, but all in.
That's right.
Eric, I want to come back to some questions we're getting about recycling and zero waste models. We've got a couple coming in, so I'm just going to sort of throw them at you a little bit. We have someone from the Philippines looking for models for segregated collection and waste reduction services. So basically source separating, compost and recycling. We also have someone from Germany talking about rural economies. And so I'm wondering, just sort of to tie those together, can you talk a little bit about any of the recycling or waste related social enterprises you know about around the world, or other viable models? I know you mentioned EcoCycle and Eureka Recycling, an ecology center in the US. I'm wondering if there are others you can talk about.
Well, Kate, I think this is a good time to plug the roadmap that you and I wrote 4 or 5 years ago. We pulled together, decades of experience into a 43-page free how-to booklet roadmap on zero waste community building. And I would really, you can go to the EcoCycle Solutions site, right, Kate? It's still there for free. And I would really suggest people go get the roadmap, where we've laid out all of our best practices and our examples on what needs to be done. Now, when it comes to your individual situation, there is no single answer. If you're rural, it's different than if you're urban. If you're in a sector where the government is involved, that's very different than, say, the Rocky Mountain states, where there's very little government involvement. So there's not a blanket answer to that question. Look at the roadmap. I am available to talk with anybody who wants to follow up on this conversation. I would love to, actually. Because I think we're at the beginning of creating a whole new approach to zero waste community building using social enterprise as the vehicle. And so I think that's the next chapter that I have to write to the roadmap. So that's all I can say is go get the roadmap and then contact me when you have specific questions.
Can you also talk about, I'm thinking about Blue Star Recycling and electronics recycling and some of the furniture reuse and repair in Scotland, just so folks can think outside of just the traditional recycling bin, that there are opportunities throughout the waste stream.
Yeah, there's fantastic work going on in the reuse and repair and recycling, hard to recycle areas of social enterprises. As a matter of fact, social enterprise is the only game in town because there's not enough profit in any of those resource management strategies. So we're seeing wonderful work around the world on reuse, repair, and hard to recycle items. And so there's plenty of evidence that that's a good way to go. You may or may not need to be nonprofit. A lot of those projects are nonprofit because they get support, philanthropic support. It would be great if we could see those move into for-profit modes, but it's really tough. The business plan is really tough for those areas, and that's why for-profit waste management firms are not moving into them, and nonprofit resource managers are. So that's a perfect, social enterprise is functioning at that level now. So that's the United States success story, and but it's time we kick it up above the one-offs, so that local governments understand that they're missing opportunities here to go bigger.
And there's areas like fashion, which there's an increasing trend against disposable fashion, and there's some fabulous global examples of social enterprises that are doing the upcycling and reuse in relation to fashion, and campaigning to stop stuff being made in unethical conditions, so that to change the future of the fashion industry. But groups like Upasana Design in India are doing some amazing work and are a model really worth following in relation to how to gain enough value from your upcycling transaction to actually support people who are disadvantaged in the labor market. So there's areas like transportation, where many of the alternative and zero carbon transportation schemes are increasingly the preserve of social enterprise, partly, as Eric says, because there isn't huge opportunity for profit extraction. And Kartik from Germany put a question up about rural areas. Between now and October, we will be launching at Social Enterprise World Forum a Slack group dealing with rural social enterprise. So that'll be a community whose primary interest is social enterprise in rural areas, where in some countries, I know Scotland, for instance, that our Highlands and Islands have 9% of the population of Scotland, but they have 22% of the social enterprises, because there is no commercial motivation to go to an area where you've got higher distance from market costs to get your product to its market, or you have challenges of qualified labour force. So many of the businesses that respond to the needs of community, both in terms of environment and preserving the environment, and resilient communities, retaining their young people and their older people, these answers are often found in social enterprises that are responsible to the community.
That's great to see rural leading in an area for a change. It's refreshing. And I also appreciate that you brought textiles into the conversation. I think what's exciting to me about social enterprises and zero waste is we have a global waste movement and tons of opportunities to move forward on a variety of areas, communities, materials. So it's exciting to hear about this burgeoning global movement. So we just want to wrap us up here and thank Gerry and Eric tremendously for all of their time and expertise in this field. I'm wondering if you each want to close this out for a minute about any advice you have for folks or some of the great resources you mentioned. We'll start with you, Gerry. Any closing remarks for our global audience?
Sure. There's one question about which is a good place to start on communicating quarterly results. I think the question, the issue is about communicating your social and environmental impact, not necessarily quarterly, but working out what's the best way for you. If you're involved in social enterprise or an environmental enterprise, of letting people know in a transparent way the impact you're having. It's good for you internally to have a focus on that, so that people who aren't frontline, who are in finance and HR, also have an appreciation of the impact your business is having. And I would just say that our Social Enterprise World Forum website, SEWF Online, is a source of information about our future events, about potential partnerships. We have a resource section where we have most of the recent strategies and policies on social enterprise, because the policies that are being developed now are all borrowing structure and content from those that have been developed over the last 10 years. So it makes the job, those following early and late adopters, much easier than it was for the innovators.
And I will close with 2 points. The first one is to plug the World Forum that Gerry puts on every fall. If you get a chance to attend it, you won't be sorry. And it would be wonderful to see you there. And we'll continue our discussion, our networking around the idea of building zero waste and clean energy communities. And my second point is the United States is missing out on this boat. When I go to Gerry's World Forum, there's very few people from America at this conference. And so I'm interested in getting a zero waste social enterprise network going in the US. And if anybody on this call is interested in joining me on that, send me an email and we can get the discussion going, because Gerry promised me that the World Forum's coming to North America one of these years and we can all meet there.
Excellent. Well, with that, I want to again really appreciate Gerry and Eric, both your time and your leadership on this important front. And thank you so much for the resources you provided to the world and for joining us on this webinar today. And with that, we're going to kick it back to Ranjith to wrap us up and tell us about future panels.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you so much, Kate. You've been doing a wonderful job with the moderating. So friends, our focus from this year has been to find moderators with really diverse backgrounds, but who themselves are thought leaders and can bring great perspective to the conversations on waste, because we believe the conversation should be diverse, and we should take and that's the best way to move forward and progress together. So with that, we have another panel. It's not a panel, it's actually an online conference coming up next month. We are organizing that with the International Solid Waste Association's Young Professionals Group, and they've put together a great lineup of speakers. And the topic is, how do countries and communities transition from open dump sites to circular economy? And I believe, innovative business structures, and especially social enterprises with, the mission-driven energy can, play a great role in, that kind of huge transition. So thank you, friends, for joining us today. Thanks, Kate, Gerry, and Eric. We'll see you in more webinars in the future, hopefully. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.